Oh boy, here I go causing drama again. I've been thinking about this video a lot. I've wanted to do it for probably over a year now. As we've talked about with everything from Tailwind to server components, I don't find separation of concerns as a default to be a great experience. And I hear all sorts of arguments for it. And every time I do, they feel like they hold less and less water. If you're not already familiar with the concept, separation of concerns is the idea that you should break apart your app and categorize it by the types of things parts do. The most common way to do this is through the MVC model, the model view controller model. So if I define these things myself, everybody's gonna be mad. So I'm using the Wikipedia definition. The model is the central component of the pattern. It's the application's dynamic data structure independent of the user interface. Notice how they have to specify this, because normally the data structure is defined by the user interface. The view is the thing that actually shows whatever the model has determined to the user. And the controller is what accepts the inputs and converts it to commands for the model or the view. This separation is entirely arbitrary and makes no sense in modern times at all. When all of these things were different parts of your infrastructure and HTML as the view was an incredibly limited piece, this model made a lot of sense. When you look at things like Angular, especially the OG Angular JS, it's clear they were building around this model. But when you look at React, they kind of threw it away because React didn't see MVC as a necessary way to separate things. They saw an opportunity to allow developers to separate things how they chose. They effectively took these parts, combined them together, and gave you as a developer the ability to define the boundaries yourself. And the tweet that inspired this video most recently comes from Mark Dalgish, the creator of Vanilla Extract, one of the OG CSS wizards, especially in the React world. He helped create CSS modules, and now he's working on Remix. He tweeted this a couple weeks ago. Been over 8 years since this commit, and I still can't apologize enough. Truly, I'm sorry. What is this commit? This is him adding the no set state rule into ESLint plugin React. What this rule does is it allows you to specify that no components can actually update their own state. So if you want to do state updates, you would do that externally through like a UI library, like Material UI or something. And then the components themselves just pass data in a very static way. The goal of this was to separate the update layer from the React view layer, because at the time, if you were really deep in the MVC mindset, this seemed like a good idea. The harsh reality of this is that it made our lives exponentially more complex. When you want to make a change, maybe you want to change what state is the default, or what the behavior is when a user does a certain thing, or just have code that runs when the state changes. If that state is 7 layers away from where you currently are, even finding the file it's in is going to be a massive challenge, and updating it in a way where it doesn't break other things is nightmarish. The closer you can locate the things that affect your code and the code that causes them to appear in the first place, the easier it is to maintain, understand, review, work with, and maintain that code over time. I've never in my life, regardless of the scale of company, worked in a code base where the separation of concerns made real changes easier to understand and do. Because what ends up happening is you miss one of the 15 places that needs to be changed for that code to work, and it looks fine in code review, but because you don't see all of the ways this code impacts things, it's actually very broken. And if you have one component that has all of your model logic separated from the actual places being consumed, and you make a change to that code, it's not apparent in the code review which things are actually affected by that change, because you're just seeing the code itself that changed, not the places it's being consumed. This is why this model doesn't make a lot of sense with modern development. This is also a huge part of why I like Tailwind. I know a lot of people are upset seeing so much words in their JSX and eventually in their HTML that gets output, but by co-locating the styles with the thing that renders them, it's become way easier to see exactly what's causing a behavior, to make changes when you want that behavior to be different, and to code review it when you want to see what they're doing. It's also made it way harder to accidentally leave old styles behind, because if you separate your styles into a different file that has CSS in it, and you stop using the class, how do you know that you can delete that class safely? You don't, so it stays there forever. I will guarantee that at least 1/4 of the CSS on the Twitch site right now is not being used for anything, because they're scared to delete it, because there is no relationship between that CSS that's in the file and the actual thing rendering in the HTML, other than being named correctly inside of the React component. And I can't tell you how many times I had code that should have worked that wasn't, and it turned out I just slightly misspelt the name or forgot what it was from a CSS file and was accessing it in the component. Or worse, there was 2 things that had the same name for the CSS. It's unreliable at best. But we haven't even got to the fun part, which is the server client side of things. You might think that my stance stops once we hit the server. It's like, obviously the server needs to be a controller of some form, and the UI takes what that sends it and does whatever it has to from there. What if I told you the server could just send the right HTML depending on the conditions and interface with it in the same code directly? We've done a lot of examples with server components in my content, but I really want to emphasize this. So here's a really basic example. Const data equals await get images for user. This is a SQL call. I just put it in a function so I can call it in 3 places, but it is just a SQL call. And I return image grid, which is a React component. Fun fact, both of these are actually defined in the same file, if I recall correctly. By keeping these all in the same place, it becomes much easier to see what the backend returns and how it affects the UI. So if we're trying to add a new feature, let's say if they have 0 images, we want to return something different. That goes from annoying to trivial, both to figure out where that happens and what the relationship is. And if I am a backend dev that wants to return something different depending on these conditions, maybe instead we want to return an error if you have no images. The server should return the error and the client should do something with it. But now if you change that behavior in the future, like let's say we switch from returning an error on the backend with 0 images to just returning an empty array, how do we know the client's going to do the right thing? If these things are separated far enough, you don't. And now if you have to maintain both the relationship between this backend and front end without a direct tie to them, and also the versions that both are on, because now these things can skew which version they're in, it becomes significantly harder to understand the impact of a change on either side. This is why GraphQL was invented, because it was so hard to manage this and properly define the many different permutations of the backend stuff that the front end needs. But if we don't define that separation by default, we allow the developers using this code and building these things to define these boundaries where it makes sense for what they're building. It becomes easier to build, easier to maintain, easier to add features, easier to make changes to those features, and most importantly, easier to understand what the code does. And this is my problem. Separation of concerns is almost always sold as a solution to complexity. By separating these things into these boxes, you've reduced the potential complexity of those things. What you've also done is increase the complexity of any given feature, because every feature is going to touch all of these boxes you've split up. That might be good if those boxes are the same shape as your teams, but that's not the case for most people, because teams are now being built around features, not around locations in the stack. And if I'm building a new feature on Twitch or on Upload Thing, and I'm on the front end team, and we need backend changes. Now we have this whole process with back and forth, with making changes that hopefully are backwards compatible, with realizing the API is slightly off from what we need and by bugging them to make additional changes. All of this separation makes it so much slower to move and takes away a lot of the confidence you normally would have when you make these changes. If the distance between your infrastructure and your UI code wasn't multiple teams, files, code bases, and deployment infrastructure, and instead the distance between those was 2 lines of code, it makes maintenance so much easier. And that's why I'm getting frustrated, because I've worked at a lot of different scales and I have seen separation of concerns cause significantly more problems than I've seen it solve. And I don't think it should be the default anymore. The default of a separated database, API with Express, and a single page app front end with the model, the view, and controller all separated on both the back end and the front end, this died with Rails. This isn't how we should be building anymore. And continuing to take this old mindset and apply it like it somehow magically reduces complexity, it's harmful. And I'm really tired of us pretending these things should be just because. I'm sure a lot of people are going to disagree, and I'm actually excited to see the comments on here. So if you think I'm mischaracterizing separation of concerns, or you have ideally examples of where it benefits a lot to default to these models, please tell me in the comments, because I will keep an eye on it and I'm excited to see. But generally speaking, we should default to the simplest possible thing, and we should start separating stuff when we have problems, not because we think we should. What do you think? How much do you separate your stuff? Am I absolutely crazy here? Let me know in the comments, and maybe check out this video where I talk all about full stack and why I think it's the future of development. Or check out the video below that YouTube seems to think you're going to like. Appreciate y'all a ton as always. Thank you so much. Peace, nerds.